everybody in the world.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you as always to consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website gsmcpodcast.net, to better contribute and interact with our show if you so feel inclined. But other than that, it just makes our show that much better when you, our faithful audience, are leaving your opinions, feedback, and input in our comment section and giving us good tips on what we can improve on, what you really like about the show, or just any of your thoughts on all things sports. It just makes our show that much more interactive and thus that much better with your support. So we genuinely appreciate it in advance and look forward to hearing from you. Well, without further ado, let's jump right into our second What's Next for CFP team segment of the day, talking about a team that I don't necessarily think will be in the mix next year in terms of a playoff spot. And it's no indictment of their incredible 2024 season. It's just that I think expectations for this team need to be tempered just a little bit after a stunning season in 2024. That's the Indiana Hoosiers. Like I said, I really love what Indiana was able to do this year. I know a lot of people down there in Bloomington who are really hyped about this season, but unfortunately, out of all the CFP teams we talked about thus far, I think that they're the least likely to return, just because year 2 of the Curt Cignetti era, there's no way it's going to look like year 1. There are no more James Madison transfers walking through the door. In fact, a couple of them are leaving, including your former starting QB, Curtis Rourke, to the NFL. However, Indiana fans can breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief on the defensive side of things, where Mikael Kamara has committed to staying at Indiana for one more season. But looking at how this team's going to transition into 2025, I just can't see them being able to keep pace with the other elite teams in the Big Ten. Last year's schedule was a lot easier than 2025's is going to be. They kind of have a lot of road trips against very solid teams, perhaps the most elite teams in the Big Ten as well. And I just don't think they'll be able to stockpile wins much like last year with their easy schedule with this year's schedule. But let's talk about what they've already been doing proactively in the offseason to try and make it so that they can still remain, at very least, a competitive Big Ten team. I don't necessarily think it will spell 10 to 11 wins in a playoff spot, but I could see a season where this Indiana team wins about 7 or 8 games and it's seen as satisfying, because realistically, I don't necessarily like the profile of this team going into next year, but there is hope and optimism that at the very least they can maintain a modicum of success from last season and maybe score a couple of upsets as well. So let's talk about what they've been doing proactively in the offseason before we jump to any conclusions. But let's start off with the bad side of it. Obviously, you lose Curtis Rourke after this season. Obviously, only a 1-year kind of situation there, as he came in from James Madison, deciding to apply his trade in the NFL. Ultimately, I feel like, transferring in and playing as well as he did for Indiana was the best case scenario for a kid like Curtis Rourke. Actually, not from James Madison. He was from Miami of Ohio, but Curt Cignetti brought in a lot of James Madison. This is a very confusing Indiana team from last year, because there were a lot of transfers, but unfortunately I messed up a little bit and said that Curtis Rourke was one of the many James Madison transfers that came in with Curt Cignetti, but in fact he was a Miami of Ohio kid. But ultimately, I feel like that was a best case scenario for him either way, whether he was a James Madison guy or a Miami of Ohio guy. But I do feel like Curtis Rourke, losing him is going to definitely factor in to how this offense profiles. They do have a couple of transfer portal additions that could supplement his loss. In terms of an actual quarterback, Cal's Fernando Mendoza comes over, and he is kind of one of those boom or bust projects. I mean, he had a couple decent games last year for Cal. That Miami game was pretty impressive. But ultimately, he's not necessarily, the best transfer quarterback you could have gotten. And obviously, John Matier would have been a nice situation, but he's obviously thinking of bigger and better things, potentially playing for Indiana. So at least getting someone like a Fernando Mendoza with that experience is solid, but it's definitely not what you would want completely if you're an Indiana fan for next season. But I do think that he'll be decent enough to win them a couple of Big Ten games. But then, I feel like, in terms of rebooting this offense, I feel like you also need to supplement the backfield because you are also losing Justice Ellison, who was pretty decent in his only season with Indiana. And you did sign UAB transfer Lee Beebe, and I really liked that pickup. He had more than 1,100 yards with Western Kentucky. No, UAB actually. I did say that. But ultimately, I feel like this team's definitely going to profile a little bit more differently on offense next year. Because Fernando Mendoza, I do feel like he has some similar traits to Curtis Rourke, but what I liked about Curtis Rourke is he was able to be accurate and he knew what he was good at, and ultimately, because he knew what he was good at, didn't make too many mistakes in order to really derail the situation. Fernando Mendoza, I feel like, has the same abilities in terms of accuracy, but in terms of decision making, I don't necessarily know if he's as sharp as a Curtis Rourke. So it's going to be interesting to see. Maybe they lean on a guy like Lee Beebe. But then I feel like in the receiving room, that's where you can get a little bit more depth if you're Indiana. I feel like pass catcher LeBron Bond is going to be a very interesting guy to look out for, a top recruit for them, one of 6 top prospects in Indiana's recruiting class from this year. And I feel like he's someone who is definitely going to be truly revered by a lot of Indiana fans, because in Curtis Rourke's tenure, there really wasn't one guy who rose above the others, but this wide receiver class for Indiana is looking pretty elite, and LeBron Bond leads the list. But now, let's transition to the actual strength of this team, because a lot of Curt Cignetti teams are known for their excellent defenses, especially in the front. And that front got a lot of good news with Mikael Kamara deciding to return for next season. He is the heartbeat of that defense, and I really like what he can do and how versatile he is. But they are still losing a lot of pieces from this defense. You lose James Carpenter, who perhaps had the best game of any defensive player for Indiana in their lone CFP game against Notre Dame. He had a blocked field goal, 2 tackles for loss. So you're losing that guy. In the interior, you're losing CJ West as well. 2 players who you really need to find replacements for. But ultimately, Mikael Kamara staying is a huge plus because you're not losing all 3 of those guys. And I think Mikael Kamara is the best of all 3 of those guys, in my humble opinion. And you don't necessarily have to completely rebuild. But they are doing well in terms of replenishing the Carpenters and Wests of the world. I feel like bringing in Western Kentucky, this is where Western Kentucky comes into play. Defensive tackle Hosea Wheeler, who was a first-team All-Conference USA selection at WKU, is going to help up front as well. And then you also... Actually, I don't think they signed anyone else defensively, but they did pick up a 4-star safety in recruiting who can really bolster that secondary. Byron Baldwin, the 4-star, but ultimately, by being proactive and continuing to be proactive on the defensive side of the football, Curt Cignetti can really begin to put his stamp on this team in 2025, because that's where I think Indiana's bread and butter is going to come from. Stout defensive play. And with Mikael Kamara returning, potentially Hosea Wheeler being a big factor and contributor, and then Byron Baldwin shoring up the secondary, that could be where Indiana's focal points lay in terms of winning football games next year. Because I think this offense can steal you a couple of games. But like I said, I'm not as confident in Fernando Mendoza being an apt replacement for Curtis Rourke next season as some Indiana fans, because I truly think the beauty of last year was that Curt Cignetti knew a lot of these transfers, not just from James Madison, but knew who he wanted immediately. And he brought them over with him, and they seamlessly integrated into this Indiana team. This year it's going to look a little bit different. And I feel like, it's not necessarily going to be smooth in terms of how these transfer players and recruits pan out in the season. Because everything's fine and dandy when I talk about it, right? By bolstering your defensive front with a guy like Hosea Wheeler, bolstering your secondary with a guy like Byron Baldwin, then getting a nice replacement for Ellison in the backfield and Beebe. Everything sounds nice. But ultimately, my concern is that because of the unfamiliarity of some of these transfers for Curt Cignetti, how they coalesce with this team and how they integrate into this team. But ultimately, I feel like when looking at this Indiana's team, there's still hope for, at the very least, a 7 to 8 win season. But ultimately, they're going to be tested. They have road trips to Oregon, Penn State, and Iowa. Very tough places to play, very tough teams to play against. But fortunately, there's no non-league matchups against any Power 4 opponents. They're strictly playing the Big Ten. That works in their favor. But going on the road against those three teams in very tough environments is going to be difficult. And I would love to see, and this is going to be the most important factor for me if I'm an Indiana fan or a pundit looking at Indiana, is how Fernando Mendoza handles that. Because a lot of his big games at Cal were at home, right? The first ever time college game they went to Cal was that big game against Miami, and he did perform well in that one. But this is a whole different environment in a whole different conference that might just be the best in all of college football. So that question, can Fernando Mendoza aptly replace Curtis Rourke, will be at the forefront of how Indiana's season pans out. And if he answers it aptly, potentially Indiana could shock the world yet again. But for now, I'm tempering expectations in Bloomington. But let me know what you think about this Indiana team and their 2025 prospects in the comments below, because coming up next, we transition to the SMU Mustangs, returning potentially one of the most dark horse-like quarterback rooms in the country, and also returning a lot of top talent to ensure that their first year in the ACC was not a fluke. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about them.
Look